What if your passion for collecting turned into a nightmare you couldn't escape? Back in 2012, I worked at a small but thriving card shop in Pittsburgh, specializing in trading card games like Pokemon, Yu-Gi-Oh, and Magic: The Gathering. Our store wasn't just a local hangout spot for collectors. It was a hub for serious traders. A large portion of our business was conducted through online message boards where we bought, sold, and exchanged rare and valuable cards. These forums were also where we kept up with industry news, new releases, and major events within the trading card game, TCG, community. One morning, I walked into work to find my boss and coworkers staring silently at the office computer screen. Their expressions were grim. Curious, I peered over their shoulders to see a massive wall of text posted on one of the TCG message boards. The post detailed something terrifying. One of the largest private collections of Yu-Gi-Oh cards in the country had been stolen in a violent robbery. The details were chilling. 2 masked intruders had broken into a collector's house, held him at gunpoint, and tortured him until he gave up the location of his most valuable cards. The man had his prized collection locked in a safe, while his less valuable cards were displayed in binders. The robbers, however, didn't just grab what was on display. They knew the real treasure was locked away, suggesting they had insider knowledge of the victim's habits. The collector suffered severe injuries, losing so much blood that he required an emergency transfusion. The post warned every dealer and collector in the community to be on high alert. Thousands of dollars worth of rare Yu-Gi-Oh cards were now in circulation, and whoever had them was dangerous. The news rattled me to my core. Our store dealt in high-value trades every day. Could we be next? The very next day, something strange happened. A man walked into the store who immediately set off red flags. He didn't look like a typical collector or player. Instead of the usual TCG fan, a nerdy-looking guy in a gaming t-shirt, this man looked more like a mechanic. He wore dirty overalls, had reddish-brown hair, and kept his sunglasses on even inside the shop. He carried nothing but a thin plastic bag which he placed on the counter. "I've got some cards to sell," he said, his voice flat. My boss, a seasoned businessman with years of experience in the TCG world, was instantly wary. Instead of questioning him directly, he played it cool using a simple technique. He asked how long he had been collecting. "I'm not a collector," the man replied. "These belong to my brother. He passed away recently and I need to cover funeral expenses." My boss expressed his condolences, but something didn't add up. When he opened the bag to examine the cards, his stomach dropped. Inside were some of the rarest Yu-Gi-Oh cards on the market: Cyberstein, Dark Paladin, Black Luster Soldier, Chaos Emperor Dragon. Among them were several high-value, recently released cards that were difficult to obtain unless someone had deep connections within the community. The realization hit my boss like a truck. These were the stolen cards. He kept his composure, though, pretending to inspect them while his mind raced. The robbery had taken place in Ohio, across state lines. If someone had stolen a high-value collection and needed to sell quickly, they would likely travel to a different state to stay ahead of law enforcement. "Your brother must have been a serious collector," my boss commented casually. "What was his name?" The man gave a name that didn't ring any bells, then added that his brother wasn't from Pittsburgh. That sealed the deal. This wasn't some grieving relative. This was one of the thieves. Thinking fast, my boss made an offer. "These are worth a lot of money," he said. "I don't have enough cash on hand today, but if you come back Friday, I can put together $5,000 for the whole collection." The man agreed, shaking my boss's hand before leaving. As soon as he was out the door, we locked it and called the police. Within hours, we were speaking with detectives. Our store was now at the center of an interstate sting operation. On Friday, undercover officers arrived at our shop, blending in as customers. 2 young-looking officers disguised as teenage card collectors browsed the shelves while uniformed officers waited nearby. Our job was simple: act normal and make the sale. Hours passed. No sign of the suspect. Just when we started thinking he wouldn't show, the door creaked open. There he was, wearing the same grimy overalls and sunglasses. Tension filled the store as my boss greeted him. He went through the motions, pretending to inspect the cards again. Then he gave the prearranged signal. As he stepped into the back office, the words rang out: "State Police. Hands where we can see them." The suspect froze as undercover officers drew their weapons. There was no struggle, no escape attempt. Just shock on his face as he realized he had been caught. He dropped to his knees and within seconds he was cuffed and hauled outside. Police later found his accomplice waiting in a nearby car. The stolen collection was recovered, and the criminals were charged with armed robbery, assault, and interstate theft. The TCG community breathed a sigh of relief. knowing two dangerous individuals were off the streets. For our small shop, it was a once-in-a-lifetime experience, playing a key role in an FBI-level sting operation. But it also left us shaken, knowing how close we had come to dealing with violent criminals. It was a stark reminder that even in the most unexpected places, danger can lurk. Have you ever encountered someone suspicious in an everyday setting? How did you react? Story 2. The man at the end of the bar. Back in 2014, my family and I moved out of Manhattan to a quiet little place near Batavia, about halfway between Rochester and Buffalo. I won't bore you with the details of the move, just the one most relevant to this story. And that's the fact that the worst part of relocating wasn't packing, unpacking, or adjusting to a slower pace of life. No, the worst part was losing my bar. For over 8 years, I'd been going to the same place to watch the Yankees. It was my refuge, my go-to spot where I could walk in, nod to the bartender, and have a cold one in front of me before I even sat down. Losing that? It felt like losing a limb. Sure, I could drive back into the city or maybe take the train if I really wanted to visit. But I needed something local, somewhere I could duck into for a few beers, watch the game, and unwind without making a whole trip out of it. Finding a place like that wasn't easy. In the end, I settled for a bar within cycling distance, which led to more than a few wobbly rides home. But I found my spot, a little dive called Johnny's Bar. It had that same old-school, locals-only atmosphere I was used to, but with much cheaper beer. And hey, who needs familiar faces when you've got 3 bottles of Bud? At first, Johnny's was a tough crowd. The regulars weren't rude, just insular. It took a few visits for them to warm up to me. Johnny himself, an old guy who'd clearly been running the place forever, was friendly enough, but you could tell this was the kind of bar where the faces never really changed. And speaking of faces, there was one in particular that stood out. At the far end of the bar, there was always this one guy. Skinny as a rake, balding a little on top, with gin blossoms blooming all over his nose and cheeks. He never said much, just sat there with a glass of liquor in front of him, watching the ash of his cigarette slowly burn down. He wasn't hostile, but he wasn't exactly welcoming either. Just there. I didn't really notice how often he was there until one Wednesday afternoon. I'd taken a half day at work after a fight with the wife. Not anything vicious, just one of those arguments that leaves you needing a beer before heading home. So I rode out to Johnny's. It was dead inside, just the bartender, myself, and, of course, Skinny at the end of the bar. I greeted the bartender, ordered a beer, and started venting about my marital woes. As I talked, I glanced over at Skinny, trying to loop him into the conversation. Not because I expected much of a response, but because that's just how I am. I don't like people feeling left out. But the second I turned to him and said something along the lines of, "Women, am I right?" the bartender very subtly shook his head. Not at Skinny, but at me. Like a silent warning, don't bother. I got the message, mumbled something polite, and carried on talking to the bartender. But I kept an eye on Skinny. At one point, the bartender poured him another drink, and almost the second he turned his back, Skinny downed it in one motion. Then flatly he muttered, "Another one." There was something in the way he said it, so automatic, so devoid of emotion, that it made me uneasy. The bartender didn't argue, didn't even hesitate. He just grabbed the whole bottle and set it down in front of him, telling him he'd just add whatever he drank to his tab. Skinny nodded in thanks, then spent the next half hour draining that bottle until he could barely stand. When he finally got up to leave, he almost fell off his stool. I watched him steady himself, take a deep breath, and then shuffle out the door, disappearing into the night. Once I was sure he was out of earshot, I turned to the bartender and asked, "What's that guy's deal?" The bartender sighed. He was quiet for a long moment, staring off like he was deciding how much to tell me. Eventually he said, "That guy used to be an undercover cop." I thought, well, that explains a lot. Probably had some run-ins with violent criminals. Maybe even got into some nasty situations, had a gun in his face a few too many times. But then the bartender added something that made my stomach sink. He wasn't just any kind of undercover. He worked online. Now I was confused. What kind of online work could leave a man so broken? The bartender went on to explain. See, most undercover cops rotate out every few months. It's a high-stress job and no one stays in too long for their own sanity. But online investigations? They work differently. You didn't need to swap out cops as often because you weren't physically infiltrating gangs or cartels. You were just making new profiles. That was Skinny's job. He didn't go undercover to bust drug dealers or biker gangs. He posed as one of them. But not just any criminals. Pedophiles. He spent years pretending to be one of them, gaining their trust, worming his way into their online circles, getting them to share their collections of unspeakable horrors. Because just talking about it wasn't enough. They needed proof to make an arrest. He had to convince these monsters to send him evidence. And then, worst of all, he had to look at it. He did this for years. Every single day he stared into the abyss, hunting down the worst of humanity. And he refused to stop. Other cops took leave, burned out, quit. But Skinny? He kept going. Over and over. Because every day off was another day those monsters were free. And then one day he just couldn't do it anymore. He turned in his badge and disappeared. It wasn't until months later that his old colleagues came looking for him. One of them walked into Johnny's with a picture of Skinny, asking if anyone had seen him. At first nobody said a word. But then the cop pulled out his badge, not as a threat but as a plea. He wasn't here to arrest Skinny. He was here because they were worried about him. He'd vanished after quitting and they feared the worst. They wanted to help. But by the looks of him now, half conscious at the bar, drowning in liquor, it was clear their efforts were in vain. The bartender finished his story, shaking his head. He just sits here, drinks and leaves. That's it. Every night. He doesn't want to remember what he's seen. He wants to forget. And looking at the empty seat where Skinny had been, I knew. He never would. Story 3. The night my Nana caught a killer. I was born in a little place called Edgewick, a neighborhood in the English city of Coventry. Growing up in the 1970s, I had the kind of childhood that doesn't exist anymore. One filled with scraped knees, pellet guns, and afternoons spent fishing with my granddad. But if I had to pick my favorite person in the whole world back then, it would have been my Nana. She was an absolute saint. She made the best roast potatoes I've ever had, even to this day. She always had gingerbread men ready when we went around for tea, and wherever she walked, people would stop her to say hello. As a kid, I thought it was just because she was as lovely to everyone else as she was to me. It wasn't until I was much older that I realized why everyone knew and respected her so much. My Nana wasn't just a kind old woman with a knack for baking. She was a war hero. A woman in the darkest nights. During World War II, when most able-bodied men were sent off to fight, women stepped up to fill roles they wouldn't have otherwise been expected to do. Some became factory workers. Others became police officers. My Nana? She became an air raid warden. That meant she was responsible for making sure the blackout rules were followed. During German bombing raids, entire cities would go dark to make it harder for enemy pilots to spot their targets. If even a sliver of light peeked through a curtain, wardens like my Nana would bang on the window hard enough to rattle the glass, warning people to put it out immediately. But one night, while making her rounds, Nana heard something that made her stop in her tracks. A scream. It cut through the stillness of the blackout like a knife, coming from somewhere several streets away. In the eerie silence of wartime Coventry, a scream in the night was never a good sign. She took off running toward the sound, and as luck would have it, she bumped into another air raid warden, a man this time. Together, they sprinted toward the source of the scream, searching the dark streets for any sign of trouble. And then they found her. A young woman lying in an alleyway, bleeding. She had been stabbed nearly to death, but miraculously she survived. When the police questioned her, she described her attacker as a working-class man in an overcoat and cap, nothing distinctive. The police also discovered something else about her. She was a prostitute. Or at least she was assumed to be. In those days, a woman walking the streets alone at night, dressed up, was rarely doing so for innocent reasons. She never admitted it, likely out of shame, but whether she was or wasn't, one thing was certain. She was lucky to be alive. But the next woman wasn't. The Blackout Ripper. Just days later, another woman was attacked in nearly the same spot. This time there was no scream. No warning. Just a body in the morning. And then another. And another. People were terrified. The Germans were dropping bombs from the sky, and yet it wasn't the Luftwaffe that was keeping them awake at night. It was him. Some thought he was a German agent sent to terrorize the people. Others whispered that it was Coventry's very own version of Jack the Ripper. All anyone knew was that he was hunting women in the dark. Prostitutes vanished from the streets entirely after that, but the killer wasn't deterred. Desperate for blood, he tried breaking into the home of a woman he thought was alone. Luckily for her, she wasn't. Her husband was upstairs in the bath, and when he heard the commotion, he came running, naked as the day he was born, chasing the attacker out of the house. Maybe it was the shock of a furious, soap-covered man barreling toward him that made the killer flee, but it was clear now that prostitutes weren't his only targets. No woman was safe. The people of Coventry were outraged. They demanded the police do more, that they stop this man before he claimed another life. But what could they do? They doubled the patrols, but they couldn't be everywhere at once. And besides, the Ripper was careful. He never struck when officers were near. That's when my Nana stepped forward. The bait. She had a plan. A dangerous one. She would pose as a prostitute and bait the killer into attacking her. When he did, she'd blow a whistle to alert the officers hiding nearby, who would rush in and arrest him. Sounds like a decent plan, right? Except they didn't give her a gun. Or a club. Nothing but a tiny tin whistle. That's it. The police had batons at least. But my Nana? She had her wits, her bravery, and a little metal whistle she could easily drop if she so much as sneezed. The night she stopped a killer. That night, she dressed in her finest, put on her makeup, and walked the dark streets alone. Hours passed. Nothing. Then, as she turned down a narrow back street, a dead end, she heard footsteps behind her. A figure stood at the entrance. He wasn't a cop. And he wasn't walking away. Instead, he took a step forward. Then another. Then she saw it. The glint of a knife. Nana reached for her pocket, fingers closing around the whistle. Her only chance. But as she pulled it out, it got caught on a brass button, slipping from her grasp and tumbling into the darkness. For a moment she froze. This was it. But then something inside her snapped. A surge of defiance shot through her and she reached down, not for the whistle but for her shoe. She whipped it off and brandished it like a weapon. The Ripper laughed. "What are you planning to do with that?" he sneered. And that's when Nana barked at him, loud enough for half the city to hear. "My name is Warden Eileen Thompson, and you're bloody well under arrest." Another laugh. This one more nervous. Then she took a step toward him, waving the shoe like a madwoman. "I'll take your bloody eye out with this heel if you come near me." Maybe it was the sheer audacity of it. Maybe he wasn't used to women fighting back. But for a split second he hesitated. And that was all she needed. Behind him, two policemen rounded the corner, sprinting full tilt toward them. The Ripper turned, realized he was trapped, and tried scrambling over a wall. Too late. The officers grabbed his legs, yanked him down, and beat him into the cobblestones before dragging him off. A hero remembered. That was the night my Nana stopped a serial killer. She became a local hero, her name printed in every newspaper in Coventry. Even decades later, when her memory started to fade, she never forgot that night. She saved Edgewick from the blackout Ripper. And if she hadn't, I wouldn't be here to tell you the story. But here's the real question. If you were in her shoes, alone, facing a murderer in the dark, what would you have done? Story 4. The Hotshot Trap, an undercover cop's brush with death. If you put a gun to my head and told me that I had to tell you the craziest true story you'd ever heard, or else I'd tell you this one. I used to be an undercover cop in Washington, D.C. My cover? A street junkie. And I was good at it, so good that I did 3 full stints before my character was killed off, so to speak. What made me so convincing? The same thing that makes an Oscar-winning actor. The way you carry yourself. Your mannerisms. Your physicality. For my junkie persona, I keep my stomach tight like I was cramping, drop my shoulders low, walk fast, and constantly wipe sweat off my brow. The stomach cramps were key. People saw that and either pitied me or ignored me completely. I became invisible. No one noticed me except for the other street junkies. But once I earned their trust, everything else fell into place. My job was simple: gather intelligence. I'd live the lifestyle, minus the drugs, for months at a time, then take a break, telling the junkies I was going to visit family out in the country. Then I'd be back on the line good as new. One of the biggest early wins my task force had was closing a violent gang assault case. The victim was just a civilian who got caught in a mess over a missing package. We sent the perps to federal prison, and the whole city breathed a little easier. But what we didn't know was that it was what they call a Pyrrhic victory. Because right after we locked those guys up, the death toll on the streets skyrocketed. Within a month, overdoses were up 500%. The chief of police wanted answers, fast. At first, it seemed like a bad batch of heroin was circulating. But then, veteran junkies, guys who knew the game inside and out, started dropping. And junkies, despite their desperation, are street smart. If bad dope is going around, they spread the word. They avoid it. And yet, they were still dying. That's when I knew something was very, very wrong. I started doing my usual rounds, not asking too many questions, just listening. What I learned chilled me. This wasn't some rookie dealer stepping on his product too hard. This bad dope was coming from everywhere. Junkies were dodging one dealer only to score from their safe guy, and still end up dead. Panic was setting in. People were scared. And when junkies get scared, they get desperate. One day we had 4 pharmacy robberies. That's when I knew this wasn't just a bad batch. This was something else. While other junkies were avoiding their usual dealers, I was hunting for this poison, determined to find the source. Every bag I bought went straight to evidence for testing. But despite the wave of overdoses, none of the samples I collected tested hot, meaning fatally laced. I was getting frustrated. Everyone seemed to be finding this deadly dope except me. And then, one day I finally got my wish. That morning, I was on the streets by 7:30 a.m. doing my thing. Eventually, I got in touch with one of my regular dealers. But this time, something was different. Instead of making the usual quick exchange, he told me to get in his car. We had to go somewhere. I hesitated. This was out of the ordinary. But I got in. We ended up at a trap house, which wasn't unusual. But what was unusual was who gave me the bag. A lieutenant, a guy who normally wouldn't be involved in direct sales. He didn't just hand it over either. He sat me down and started asking questions. Who was I buying from? Who had the best product? Had I ever been arrested? I answered as honestly as I could, throwing in details from a couple of staged arrests we'd done for credibility. After a few more questions, they gave me the bag and sent me on my way. I took it straight to evidence. What I didn't know at the time was that it contained a hot shot, a dose of heroin deliberately laced to kill. The next day I was back on my routine. Early afternoon, I went to my usual spot outside a liquor store to beg for smokes. The store owner never gave me anything, but our back and forth helped cement my presence in the area. But that day something was off. Instead of his usual insults, the store owner called me by my street name. The problem? He didn't know my street name. If he did now, it meant someone had been asking about me. Then he told me someone had called the store looking for me. Not in person, on the phone. That's when my alarm bells went off. No one on the street used phones. If someone wanted to reach me, they'd leave a message with a person or a place, not a phone call. Whoever this was, they weren't a junkie. I found the nearest payphone and called our office. As soon as they picked up, my contact said 5 words I'll never forget. You should be dead already. Then he told me to get off the street, immediately. Turns out, narcotics had a wire in the trap house from the day before. They overheard the dealers discussing how they'd been selling hot shots to flush out an undercover. 50 junkies had already died. When I bought that bag and didn't use it, they knew I was the cop. A green light was put on me. By the time I was picked up, there were probably 100 guys running around with pistols, just waiting for the chance to put me in the ground. I shouldn't be alive. If surveillance hadn't overheard my name, if I hadn't stopped by that store at the right moment, if I had waited just an hour longer, dead. To outsiders, it looks like the system worked. But I know better. I won the lottery of life that day. No guardian angel, no divine intervention, just sheer ridiculous luck. And I've been thinking about it ever since. So let me ask you, if you knew your next decision could mean the difference between life and death, how would you act?